one day we messaged like, come pick up your Uber phone, your background check is cleared, et cetera, et cetera. And during office hours, a driver at the end like came in. It was like two guys, and they basically pulled out a gun and took all of the iPhones. And it was just a horrible, horrible experience. This happened while a couple of people were in the room and the rest of us were standing in the office. And I still remember to this day, like the employee came back, and he's a good friend, and he's like, they had a gun. It was just terrible, right? We didn't find those iPhones, but driver operations is a rough place. But, we did it because it was really important part of the business, and we were doing something that helped move people around cities.
Welcome to the Early Podcast, where I interview the builders behind the world's most iconic companies. I'm Max Crowley. I was Uber's 25th employee and spent years scaling one of this generation's wildest rides. Each week, I sit down with the early innovators who really made it all happen. So please tune in, like the show, subscribe, tell your friends, keep coming back. Let's go. All right, Scott Gorlick, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining.
Excited to be here. Many years in the making.
Yeah, it's good to see you, man. All right, so you're from Florida, grew up in Florida. You end up at Duke, obviously, great school. How'd you end up at Duke? And then when you're going through college, what were you thinking about what you were going to do next?
So I grew up in South Florida, and from a young age, I actually went to summer camp at Duke. It was the talent identification program, aka nerd camp. And actually, when it came time to apply for college, that was kind of my first choice. It also kind of so happens that we have a little bit of a basketball team. So for me, Duke was really easy choice to make in terms of college. When I got there, I always said that I wanted to be at the intersection of business and public policy, and nobody really knew what that meant. And when people left Duke, they either did one or two things when they finished up. It was either banking or consulting.
Wait, what was the summer camp?
So it was a summer camp where you would go to Duke for 3 weeks during the summer.
Okay.
You would stay in dorms. You would take a class. I think one year I took politics, another year I took psychology, and another year I took philosophy. And in between, you played Frisbee and sports, and it was like a regular summer camp.
All right. So after school, you graduate, you decide to go, you said, again, sort of banking or consulting was sort of the two paths. How'd you get in consulting? You end up not really doing it that long. You're there probably less than a year almost. Yeah. So how'd you end up in Atlanta? How'd you end up in consulting? And maybe take me through that year.
Yeah. So when I was graduating, I had done a banking internship and had an offer to go back, but I thought consulting sounded more interesting. But when I joined, I was on the road every week and quickly realized that it kind of wasn't for me. I learned a lot consulting, but, working for a client, going back and forth Monday through Thursday and sort of having like a status report to flip into an Excel sheet to a PowerPoint, it just wasn't something that really got my gears grinding. And, this was 2011 and there was a lot happening in startups. So decided to really explore the space and get to know some more companies.
And you said that you were kind of going to San Francisco and meeting with companies. What did that consist of? I mean, are those job interviews? Is that just you like kind of cold outreaching? What were the companies and how did that even kind of come about?
So it was a combination of things. And I chose Atlanta for consulting because it was warm weather. It was close to my family in Florida, and there were direct flights everywhere. So when it came time, for travel, I could be in DC on a client site. And as long as, I was back at the client site on Monday morning, I could expense my flight out to San Francisco. This was 2011, 2012. I was basically taking flights out to San Francisco every couple of weekends and meeting with startups of the day. So got to meet Square pretty early, got to meet Airbnb, met probably 50 other startups, but nothing really was clicking, in terms of being like, oh, this is the one I have to chase. Incredible companies, but I didn't find anything. And yeah, it was a lot of cold emailing. It was hustling to kind of get into events and just trying to make something happen.
And are those just random connections at the company? Who was sort of maybe the profile of person that you were targeting?
I'd email the founder, CEO. I'd email the co-founder. I would try to network with VCs, probably badly. Or, I would, find some people that had like a Duke connection and reach out through that.
Yeah. I mean, look, in one of the prior pods with Ryan McKillen, he talks about sort of going to the center of the universe for the thing that you want to be in the mix on. And obviously San Francisco, even today, even with its issues, is still the center of the universe of tech. So it makes a lot of sense that you'd be going out there and just trying getting in the mix. And I mean, dude, I did my share of cold outreach. So I totally get it. All right. So then you're in Chicago.
Yep.
You're going to like a client meeting. You have your first kind of magical Uber experience.
Yeah.
And that results in you cold outreaching to Travis, which I also did, although I did not get a reply from Travis. So tell me about the first Uber ride and then how that ends up in an email to Travis.
Yeah. So one of the most magical things is trying Uber for the first time. And we were in Chicago on a project. It was shitty weather outside, snowing. And we're trying to find a taxi to get to the client meeting. And this is your city, so you know how hard it is to kind of like find a taxi, especially when the weather's bad, which happens to be often in Chicago. And I had heard about this app where if you pressed a button, you could get a ride. I had heard about it in TechCrunch covering some launch in some city. So, while me and the other analysts are running around the block trying to get a taxi, I downloaded the Uber app, probably over a shitty 3G, 4G connection. And, was surprised when I pressed a button and 2 minutes later, like an Escalade rolled up and we got to our client dinner on time.
Yep.
So that was an incredibly magic moment. And probably that night after I got back from dinner, was working on a deck late at night and probably got the nice email from the community manager in Chicago. Hi, it's Max. Wanted to make sure your first Uber ride was great. Let me know if you have any questions, from the friendly community manager. So your email was probably like a nudge of like, hey, this is really interesting.
Dude, you should have let me refer you. I could have made a few bucks. If you just replied, would have helped you get in the mix.
So basically decided I'm going to cold email Travis and emailed from my Duke email. I figured like maybe that would have like a better chance of standing out. But honestly, like I got a reply probably a couple minutes later and he was like, what you got? So I hopped on the phone with recruiting.
Was that for Atlanta or was that just a general outreach?
General outreach. I was really interested in sort of the launcher role initially. And, he was a 23-year-old kid who didn't know anything. And because I had come in through Travis's inbox, I took the recruiting, call. And then I took an analytics test. I took the creative test. And it seemed to go well enough to the point that they were like, hey, fly out to San Francisco. And at that point, I flew out to San Francisco. We were in the office on probably like 6th and Market. I went in and spent like the morning or afternoon with Austin and Ryan. And like, it was just magic, right? Like I really enjoyed the conversation. It was great getting to know them. But, it was also clear that I was a 23-year-old kid and I was not equipped to launch cities. So, they sent me back and said like, hey, we have some other cities that are kind of coming up on our roadmap. Like, would you be interested? And I said, yeah, like I would love to, I'm already living in Atlanta. That's interesting. We're opening up Atlanta soon, and that would be really interesting. So I think Austin made the intro to Keith, who was Atlanta's launcher at the time, and then became the GM. And Keith and I went out for dinner and drinks at a bar in Atlanta with a dartboard called Ormsby's, and we really hit it off. And a couple of days later, he said, hey, do you want to launch Atlanta with me?
Crazy. And Keith, shout out to Keith. Great guy. Do you remember what your email to Travis?
I think it was probably super cringeworthy. And, it's in my Duke email, so it's totally lost now. But I think it was like, hey, Travis, just tried my first Uber. Would love to see if there's a way I can help. I'm, a consultant with Deloitte. Like, let me know if there's anybody on the team I might be able to connect with.
And he replied.
Yeah.
Dude.
I think I got lucky.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I think it was funny because years later, I went up to Travis and was like, hey, I emailed you in 2011 and you ignored it or whatever. And he was like, there's no way I missed that email. And it was because, dude, he just had has the craziest work ethic ever. Yeah. He's going to reply likely. And so I actually got him to open that email and it was like unread. And he was like, all right, I'll give you a point. I didn't get many points on Travis, but I got one. I got one in that scenario. So then you're in the mix with Uber. How did you end up actually accepting the offer?
It was kind of crazy. I had only been a consultant for 11 months. And, if I left the day before a year, I'd have to pay back my entire signing bonus. So, that was a big deal at the time. And, if I stayed at the consulting firm for a couple of years, I could, get my MBA paid for at a top school if I got in. So, I went back and forth like, oh, should I do my MBA? Should I, join this taxi company? And ultimately, my parents had always kind of had me on this path of being, a professional services person or a banker or a doctor or a lawyer, typical Jewish family, but they were going to support me what I did, no matter what I wanted to do. But I think what it came down to was, hey, if I take this job offer and it does well, I'll have the money to pay for business school. And if I take this job offer and it fails, at least I'll have a good story to get in.
Did you lose the money? You didn't make it to 12 months at Deloitte.
I didn't make it to 12 months. Deloitte ended up doing me a solid and had me only repay half. So I think it was like $5,000. And then on the other side, Uber was able to give me a little bit more equity.
Nice. Well, it ended up working out well.
It was a good trade, but it wasn't that much equity.
Let's jump to you accept the job. It's you and Keith in Atlanta. Take me through the first couple of weeks. I mean, at that time, we're onboarding drivers. You got a box of iPhones. You're some version of the yellow pages trying to find people that you can onboard, finding co-working space. Yeah, take me through the first couple of weeks.
So it was hard, right? It was the most 24/7, 365 operation I've ever been a part of and taught me everything you need to know about operation. The first day, I remember getting there and going on Yelp, looking up all the limo companies and drivers in Atlanta, and then just smiling and dialing and, not stopping until I got somebody on the phone. So, our goal from the conversations with drivers was to explain, hey, here's what we're doing. Would love to meet and show you sort of like what we're building. And sort of the pitch to drivers was, hey, you probably have a lot of rides Monday to the airport and Thursday from the airport, and maybe you have prom, but what are you doing in between? And, what are you doing on Friday and Saturday nights when people want to work out or want to go out? And it turns out there's a way to make a lot of money during your downtime. And a lot of drivers were willing to hear our pitch and willing to listen and give us a shot. So first out, we wanted to get in front of a lot of drivers. And when we started the market, we really, really wanted to get that initial group of drivers so that we could have them on board, even when demand was super light.
We almost made sure there was supply on the road. We would do incentives and things. Maybe just to the total layman, explain what that looked like, what we were trying to do to sort of almost artificially increase supply in the marketplace so that when someone requested a ride, they would actually get it. But obviously all that kind of comes with cost and sort of an initial cost to invest in a market.
I mean, it's a great question. And I think the way we solved it was really interesting. So, without riders, drivers can't get paid. And without drivers, riders can't get around the city. So when we launched a market, it was really important that we have drivers on the road so that when people opened the app, they would see cars, right? So the thing that we did in the early days of pretty much every market, at least until we reached escape velocity, was we'd go to the initial group of 20 or 30 drivers. Probably we would work with some of the larger limo companies in town. And we'd say, hey, we're going to pay you $30 an hour or $20 an hour to be online, no matter what, even if you don't get any rides. So what we would have is we'd have 8-10 cars sort of on the road and have coverage all the time. The second thing that we do is we would go ahead and position these cars strategically. In Atlanta, for example, we wanted to have cars in Buckhead. We wanted to have cars in Midtown. We wanted to have cars downtown so that we could basically be where the hotspots were so that if somebody was requesting a ride, even when we weren't super popular, they would have a short ETA. And then the third thing we did when we were sort of growing the market early is the product was just naturally viral. A lot of times when you were taking a ride in the market, even if you were an old pro and had taken 5 rides or been to other cities, if you were going to a dinner, or out or, to a meeting, the odds are that 4 other people in your car hadn't been. So it was really easy to basically be like, hey, you just had a great product experience. Let me refer you and you'll get $10 off your first ride and I'll get $10 off my first ride. So that was a really interesting growth loop that we saw early.
Everything started with supply.
Yep.
And coming from, I was obviously a demand side guy. You knew though very early on, this was all going to be about drivers. Drivers sort of push the flywheel to start. We got to make sure there's supply out there. And anytime somebody doesn't get a ride, it's sort of we would call it a zero or an unfulfilled request and try and make it right. First couple of weeks in Atlanta, at that time, we didn't know how sort of driving cities were going to do. Los Angeles, Atlanta, everybody's got a car. Everybody kind of drives themselves. Not a ton of mass transit. We're not crushing it out right away. Again, this was ultimately just weeks. It wasn't like it was months of struggle. But at that time, the next hour feels incredibly important. So take me through kind of your first couple of weeks are slow. Then all of a sudden you flip. You go from 1 of 10 cars filled to every car filled. What's the first couple of weeks as you're like, oh my God, is this going to work like? And then when it flips, what's your mindset at that time? Because that also obviously comes with a ton of work and onboarding drivers and everything else.
When we started, people told us that Atlanta was a driving city and it wouldn't work here. And we had a quiet 2 weeks, right? The first 2 weeks in the market, we had a couple cars on the road, 1, 2 cars full, nothing really going on. And then I remember we were in Chicago, all the operations managers for like a summit in the US, and we're going through like best practices and processes and figuring out like exactly how to scale. I remember talking to Mara and Billy, and they were like, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. Just you wait. So that night, like literally we're sitting around, like all of the cities are kind of getting busy. You have Boston, you have DC, you have LA, like everything's lighting up. And, I'm looking down at my phone. There are probably like, 0 of 10 cars full. And then all of a sudden, we have all 20 cars full and we've got another 100 people looking for rides. And from that point, it was sort of game on.
What was the impetus for that? Do you know what happened? It was just kind of flipped?
It was probably some sports event or concert. Justin Bieber was like a big draw back in the day, and we had to tell the drivers that like he was coming to town. But my guess, it was kind of a combination of like our word of mouth getting around along with some events getting out. And we just were chronically undersupplied from then on. I think Uber probably had some of the most violent product market fit of any consumer company of all time. And it was just a constant challenge to make sure that we had enough cars to fill the demand.
Yeah, that is sort of the awareness game, right? You hear about something, you see it, your friend tells you about it. You're like, when am I going to use this and not? And then all of a sudden, you're leaving a Justin Bieber concert. It's chaos. You're like, oh my God, get me a ride as fast as possible. And all right, so a couple weeks in, or a couple months in, you guys get kicked out of the office in Atlanta.
Oh yeah.
That was kind of a thing. I mean, it was almost a rite of passage. Like that meant you were really onboarding drivers if you've ruined your co-working space or you get kicked out of your office or whatever it might be. So what happened there?
Yeah, so we were in a co-working space, and this was pre-WeWork. And, it was an industrial sort of like loft space with a bunch of other startups there. And we had like a tiny private office in there. And the nature of our business is we grow when we get more drivers. So we had drivers kind of coming, and all the time they would park in like all different places around, the office, not where they're supposed to be parking. They would park in different places. And, the co-working space just had enough of sort of the situation. There were a couple situations with like drivers getting in the way of other people doing work. I feel really guilty and bad about that to that day, but, it was truly a rite of passage. And I think like the big challenge was, making sure that like we could find office space that fits us. And I remember feeling so bad that like, I thought I was going to get fired, right? Like, Keith and I had like a conversation. I was just like, oh man, am I going to have to go back to consulting? What does this look like, et cetera? And Keith was just like, nah, it's fine. We'll find another space. But 23-year-old me was scared.
Yeah. I mean, it was the beginning of a million hurdles that you'd end up crossing. So how do you guys scramble? Because like you're like onboarding drivers in your house at that time.
Yeah. So there were probably, I don't know if it was a month or a month and a half period. I mean, it probably felt a lot longer than it was. And we were already looking for like more office space. But our office space switched off sort of like overnight. So we needed to find something new. So at one point, I started onboarding drivers in like the common area, my apartment building. That worked fine, except for the fact that like all the drivers had to pull into like a private garage. And there was a driver or two that like broke the electronic gate or like hit a statue. So like that didn't last long. At one point, I took up the library at Georgia State University and started onboarding drivers there and like working with the parking lot there. I was able to make that work for a couple of days because, I said that I was doing some sort of like research project, whatever we could do to sort of onboard drivers.
I mean, did you have drivers showing up at your place then after that? Or
all the time. And I think the biggest mistake that I made on day one was I hadn't heard that like we were supposed to give out like a Google Voice number at first. So for the first few days of the market, so I'm convinced that every Uber driver and taxi driver in Atlanta still has my phone number, and my phone rings like a bunch of times every day.
Yeah, it was crazy because we were the beginning of people not really having corporate phones and easy ways to get in touch. We were trying to push people to email. So if anybody could get their hands on your phone number, customer support too, driver support, customer support. Yeah. It was like, oh my God, please nobody get my phone number, because it was just, that would go viral then.
How many times did you answer a support ticket and have somebody ask to speak to you?
It was an absurd amount. I don't even think I called anyone doing support for months.
Yeah.
I mean, we were really trying to keep it to email only, but then especially with surge pricing, things kind of escalated a bit and you would have some, unfortunate, some issues between riders and drivers that you just had to get on the phone with people, and then people spending a ton of money too. I mean, that was the other piece that, I think we were moving so fast, but if there was any critique, a critique that I would have of us early on is we probably could have done a better job of servicing some top riders and things like that were just going crazy on the platform. But, you live and learn and whatever else. Yeah. It's harder to get a hold of Uber now than it was 15 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
All right. So you end up finding another office and then you guys get robbed.
That was actually the next office.
Okay.
In the second office, we were onboarding drivers a lot. I'd have like a walk that I would kind of like do with the drivers. I'd inspect their cars out in the lot. I'd come around. I'd probably do this like 3 or 4 times a day, inspect like 5-10 cars at a time. I'd walk them back. I'd talk to them about Uber. The walk was probably like 8 minutes to get to like our little office suite.
Okay.
So I'd like walk backwards, all college like tour guide style. And then I'd give the presentation about Uber and set them up and they'd be ready to go. But one day there was a driver that got really upset over something. And he came in and actually lunged at me across the table. And that was really scary. We ended up getting security. Keith came in as well, and we were able to get out of that. But it was hard.
Those were intense days for driver operations. It's wild looking back. But what's the story about you guys getting robbed?
Yeah. So at our next office, one of the things that we were doing, like as we scaled up, and when we first started, it was just black car, right? And the first year of Atlanta, we were only black car. About a year in, we launched UberX. And with UberX, it could be anybody driving their own cars. And obviously, when you go from like having a black car product where like the average fare is $25 or $30 and go to UberX, which is, I think the way we marketed it was better, faster, cheaper than a taxi, it opens up the market in new ways to a lot more people. And a lot more people are like riding more frequency. And it also means that you need a lot more drivers. So what we did, and this is kind of like standard at different cities, was we would have like a certain amount of messaging that we'd want to the drivers like throughout the funnel. And we'd want them to kind of come in to interview and to kind of like pick up their Uber phone so that they could get started with us. So one day we messaged like, come pick up your Uber phone, your background check is cleared, et cetera, et cetera. And during office hours, a driver at the end like came in, it was like 2 guys, and they basically pulled out a gun and took all of the iPhones. And it was just a horrible, horrible experience. This happened while a couple of people were in the room and the rest of us were standing in the office. And I still remember to this day, like the employee came back and he's a good friend. And he's like, they had a gun. It was just terrible, right? We didn't find those iPhones, but driver operations is a rough place. But, we did it because it was really important part of the business. And we were doing something that helped move people around cities.
No, for sure. Man, that's scary. Did they point the gun at anybody or more it was just like, hey, they have a gun?
Or the latter.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, man, it's brutal. I mean, I remember Kenny jumping into having some crazy fiasco with drivers on the street. I mean, again, look, majority of these situations were great, right? We empowered people, gave them new wage opportunities. People were really thankful, happy. And I think probably on both sides of the house felt great about it. But obviously you're just scaling so quickly that, unfortunately you're going to run into some wild things.
I would have thought that sending a text that said, come pick up your free Uber iPhone would be a bad idea.
Yeah,
right?
I know. Come rob us.
Yeah.
Super unfortunate, but glad everybody's okay. All right. So then you were one of the first driver operations managers, right? Probably top 15 people that were hired into that role easily. What do you think, the sort of collective impact was of that group? I want to hone into like, what do you think your rubber stamp was on the company? And again, I know this is more of a collective effort. For me, on the marketing side, we did a bunch of the guerrilla stuff and a bunch of the on-demand stunts and a bunch of swag that I can for sure say my hands were on.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, other people's hands were on that as well. What do you think you can say about what you guys did from a driver operations standpoint?
I think from a driver operations standpoint, the things that we figured out and, I helped put a stamp on was how do we onboard more drivers in less time and sort of scale that up? So as we started thinking about like, okay, going from 1-to-1 onboarding to 5-to-1 to 10-to-1 to 100-to-1, what are the modules and the ways that we can do it? So we did a lot of video onboarding. We started shipping phones. We started renting out hotel rooms. We did a lot of going down to airports to acquire drivers in terms of like meeting them, spending time with them. And then I think like the other thing that I spent a lot of time on that I think we kind of figured out and something we got very wrong early was the driver comms piece. I think that like the riders, we were a bit transactional, right? Like if you look at sort of our competition in the US, I think that, in the early days, Lyft did a much better job of building a driver culture. And I think Uber was seen as sort of transactional. And, I think over time we got a lot better at that. So I think like if there's a place where I've made my mark, I think that's where, we've been. When I started, we didn't have that many drivers. And now today, Uber, works with over 7 million drivers across the world and does $150 billion in gross bookings. It's totally wild, the scale that we've reached.
Absolutely insane. So we'll jump to South by 2014.
Yep.
I was heavily involved with South by 2013, which was a show fiasco for me.
I think that was the year that lifted piggybacks on demand.
So South by Southwest, it's a annual tech conference and music conference in Austin, Texas. It was pretty big in the tech scene back then, especially. So we kind of want to make our mark. I think we started doing that in 2010, probably before I even started. I want to say that they did some sort of pop-up, certainly 2011. I was there in 12 and 13. We do the on-demand luxury cars again. We had like Bentleys and Rolls Royces the year before. We ended up parking them in a gravel parking lot and destroyed the underside of these vehicles. They guys were like, we're never going to work with you again. You guys somehow do work with them the next year, I think.
I didn't know that there were gravel parking lots, but that sounds like you guys created a little bit of a mess.
Oh my God, Matt Mara. It's definitely Matt Mara's fault. If anybody's looking for someone to blame for that.
Okay, I'll call him.
13-year ago issue, it was Matt Mara. But Austin at that time is like kind of illegal.
Yep.
Bunch of different rules that make it really difficult to do Uber down there. But obviously we still popped up for that conference. Maybe tell me more about, what we were doing at South by 2014.
Yeah. So pop-ups were a big part of Uber in the early days. This was a way for us to go to a market where we weren't yet launched yet and either, rally to get like the laws changed or to kind of like, build demand, et cetera. So early on, we did Sundance, we did Cannes, we did South by Southwest, we did the DNC. There were lots of other things that we did, but one of the hallmarks was South by Southwest. And for 2014, I guess after 2012 and 2013, you're just like, I'm not doing this again. For 2014, we decided to do a couple of different things. So we brought back the luxury cars. And this was, I think we had like 5 or 7 luxury cars. So we had 2 Rolls Royces, a couple Bentleys, an Aston Martin, and maybe there was like a Porsche or 2. And we offered those free, right? So that was free for anybody. They opened up the Uber app. It was surprise and delight. And if you got one, it was just a really cool, magical experience. The second product that we launched was Uber Black. So in Austin, there were absolutely insanely bad laws that prevented us from being in Austin full time. And the laws around Black Car in Austin were, if you reserved a car and it showed up in 1 minute, you had to legally stare at that car for another 29 minutes before being allowed to get in that car. And the minimum fare on that was $55. So, if it's South by Southwest and it's surging 3x, your minimum fare for getting in a car might be like $160. So that was a wild product to launch. There were some drivers that over like the 10 or 14 day period in South by Southwest made like $30K per car. It was truly wild. And then we did pedicabs, which is like a fun thing with Austin. Just in generally, it's kind of like a keep Austin weird thing. And we had the prices and they were fine. And I think we surged pedicabs for like the first time in history, which was kind of fun. But then the place where things got really weird was on UberX. So we had never launched UberX in Austin, if I recall correctly. And the way that we decided to do it was for hire, UberX was sort of illegal. So we decided to just make it free, right? So we onboarded a bunch of drivers and we said, okay, we're going to, pay these drivers hourly. This is a marketing expense, et cetera. And we're just going to give the rides out for free. We're going to have as many cars out there. And like, we know we're going to have a lot of people looking for rides, but we're just going to do our best. And that was kind of the thing. Our idea was the goodwill would kind of build towards like a full-time launch. And we had a sting operation going. There were cops in Austin that were requesting rides and they were planting people in these cars to take the ride. They typically tended to be like younger college student type people. And then as the rider was exiting the car in downtown Austin, the rider was instructed to place a $20 bill in the back seat and exit the car. From then, the Austin Police Department would come in and impound the car, saying that the driver was a for-hire driver and had accepted money for a trip, when in fact, the rider had just put a $20 bill in the car. So we were cited for running an illegal taxi operation. And it was just an awful situation. It was just terrible. Knack was a big part of like leading that. And I think he's probably got an interesting story there too that you should get him on.
Did anybody get arrested, or it was just a sort of company kind of formal citation?
It was company formal citation. And then I would talk to Knack. I think everything ended up just being like expunged and stuff. But in every market where we went, we had to deal with crazy laws and regulations that didn't make much sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's what makes the whole equation kind of difficult to parse out. Because, I mean, you obviously, as an Uber truther, I would say the regulations were tough. They were really sort of written for the incumbents, written in a very, sort of protective way of the people that existed in that market already. It didn't allow for anybody to sort of launch a new business and do what we were doing. And then I think regulators at times were incredibly aggressive and angry that we were doing what we were doing, which again, I understand that the reaction was what it was. But then you have some of these moments where, in the whole Uber narrative of, were we bad? Did we do things that were illegal? Some of these like crazy things that were happening from a regulatory standpoint sort of get lost in the mix when you're like, how were they doing that? And that was okay. There's a balance here of like, who's really the good guy and the bad guy? And also, what the police force should be, working on down there instead of, impounding vehicles.
Yeah. Miami had a similar set of laws.
And we paid a lot of fines in Miami and some of these markets where there were a lot of cars that were impounded. All right. So then coming out of South by, you moved to San Francisco, you joined the pro team.
Yeah.
Tell me more about the pro team. Why did you decide to make the move? And what were you kind of working on as you got going there?
So when I joined Uber, we were in 10 cities, only black car and less than 100 people. And 18 months later, we were in 100 cities and growing really fast. So as I spent more time in Atlanta, we built that business to about 10 million in run rate. And I started getting pulled into more global stuff, sort of how should we be thinking about driver operations or operations in different markets around the world? How should we be thinking about sort of our strategy when it comes to onboarding, recruiting, retaining drivers? So ended up joining the pro team in San Francisco. The easiest way I can explain it to people outside of Uber is it was like our internal like business operations team. We brought in some of the best operators from around the company in operations and community management and marketing managers to kind of, be able to help the company grow without experiencing the same pains. Because what we saw was that, the things that worked in one market would work in pretty much every market with a little nuance and regulation, a little bit of nuance and sort of like tweaking. But it was the type of thing that we just really wanted to button up and make sure that we were scaling smart. So I moved out to San Francisco to do that, ended up leading a strategic projects team. So we tackled whatever sort of the hot problems were of the week or the quarter. We worked directly with like operations teams around the globe. We worked with finance, we worked with recruiting, we worked with product and growth a little bit. But some of the projects that we worked on that were particularly interesting is we did a lot with driver payments. So thinking about how we pay drivers on a daily basis around the world and getting like our financial infrastructure stronger. We did a lot of work around driver comms and sharpening that and figuring out like, how do we communicate with drivers? Like, what is the best way? What is the best cadence, the best channel? We did a lot with prioritizing and being like the connecting glue between all the teams at Uber, whether it was like legal, finance, comms, et cetera, to just make sure that like we were scaling smart.
People have probably been listening to the show at this point, but Uber had this sort of dispersed operations team. Everybody was some version of sort of remote. We still had offices in many of these markets, but before the remote thing was kind of in vogue. And we were working on the individual markets and building a ton of process at the local level, how to onboard, how to manage drivers, how to get them on faster. And then obviously on the demand side as well. The pro team was sort of a combination of how do you start to centralize some of those functions and how do you make sure the best practices are getting shared, across all these different markets. And then also working as a connective tissue with product too, because it was hard in those days to say, hey, we need tools at the local level too, to help us grow and manage everything. And that wasn't an easy thing necessarily for them, the engineering team in San Francisco, to quite get when that was like sort of enabling our own teams. But obviously, ended up being really an important part of the tech stack as we built out that functionality. I know that you had a tweet that went super viral about driver phones specifically, and it's something that you kind of worked on from a pro team perspective. We were giving out phones. We had a ton of phones out there, and then we had to roll all that back.
Yeah. So when Uber got started, one of the biggest problems when we were trying to onboard drivers is they didn't have phones, right? Like this was 2011, 2012, even before that. So drivers didn't have smartphones. And we knew that like if we put cars on the road, we'd have demand. So our solution to this problem was to give every driver an iPhone that wanted to drive with Uber. So, the way it would work is every city would go in a Google Sheet. They'd say like, I need 100 iPhones this week. And then Jesse, shout out to Jesse, would approve it. And then the iPhones would arrive a week later. You'd get a box full of 100 iPhones still in like the packages. You'd have to like unwrap them. They were like iPhone 4s. You'd have all the accessories, etc., the car mounts, the headphones, the chargers. And we'd have to set up those phones, right? It was a really manual process. It went deep into the night. We worked out a process, I think York did, where you could set up like 8 or 10 phones at a time. And that was sort of game changing, but it was super manual. We were giving out phones to drivers. They'd come into the office for an onboarding. We'd give them the training, and then 60 minutes later, they'd leave with like a new iPhone. So this worked really well for black cars. And then, as we kept going and launched UberX, Uber became the world's largest buyer of iPhones in the world, probably bought close to 1 million iPhones. And iPhones were a lot cheaper back then, and we could buy some like used and at better prices. But if you're buying 1 million iPhones and the average price of the iPhone is $300, you're getting into really stratospheric territories very quickly. So we need to figure out, like, it's 2014, we're launching UberX. Like if we have 7 million drivers in like 10 years, like we're going to be like, own all the iPhones in the world. How do we unwind that?
And paid for the cell phone bills on that. So
yeah,
we're also paying for the service behind the iPhone as well.
Yes, but we were charging drivers per week, deducting out of earnings, but not every driver was active. So it was a huge money pit for us. So we need to figure out how to let drivers do their own phones, or BYOD. So the engineering team came up with sort of a way to get our app in the App Store, created like an Android app as well. And we started rolling that out in like late 2014. And what was interesting about that is like we needed to not only roll out BYOD and have drivers install the apps on their phones and et cetera, but we needed a way to bring all the phones back and sell them off before Apple dropped the next update and sort of nerf the value of the phones even further. So what we ended up doing was we started negotiating with carriers in different countries, right? Like in the US, you have AT&T, Verizon. In London, you have like O2. And then in India, it's just even messier. So, we had to figure out like a big giant vacuum to suck up all the phones and share them. And, in India specifically, we had actually made custom Uber phones at one point. And we had gone over to see what was going on in India. And they opened up a closet, and there was a whole closet full of phones that just had bloated batteries and had exploded. So over like a year, 18 months, we kind of cleaned that up. Adam Schwartz from DC office was a nomad for us, which was a really cool program. It was a total hero, went over to India for like 3 months-ish and did like an incredible job over there to kind of get India to sort of a more sustainable BYOD place. So when we were cleaning up the phones mess, there were a lot of people involved. Blake Samick and Chad Burton led the charge, and it was just a total team effort with lots of people involved to clean up the mess.
We had a driver come in, this is a couple of years into Uber in Chicago, with the original iPhone, close to the original iPhone, and was like, hey, I wanted to return this. And we were like, dude, we don't even remember, where did you get this? And it was Ryan Graves in early 2010 was still living in Chicago. He had gotten the job and he was doing test trips in Chicago and had given a driver a phone. And like years later, the guy came in and was like, this isn't working anymore. And you were
Where's
like,
that
wow.
phone now?
I don't know. Somewhere in Chicago. It's probably long gone. I'll ask Alan or Kenny. I'd love to get my hands on it. I know another one of the pieces that you worked on. I mean, obviously, again, the driver phone, it's hard to explain how insane this scale was as far as driver phones was concerned. I mean, again, you touch on it in your tweet. I think does a really good job of articulating it. But like, we're talking about millions of iPhones that were out in the wild. And then to get many of them back was also just a Herculean effort. I know another one of the things that you worked on from a pro team perspective was kind of evolving the sort of infamous analytics tests.
Yeah.
That's interesting to me, especially in retrospect, because we talk to so many founders and people who are interviewing in companies or trying to figure out how to recruit people. I think the analytics test really served as an important sort of stopgap on people and gave, from a recruiting standpoint, was able to give the company a rough idea of someone's, sort of analytical horsepower. Yeah. What was the analytics test? What did it look like in the beginning, and kind of what did you do to sort of evolve that?
So the analytics test was something that we gave to every operations manager or GM that wanted to join the company. And it typically took place after the recruiter screen. We're like, okay, this candidate is good. Let's see if they pass the analytics test. And the first version of it, I think Athena might have actually written it.
Yes.
And with Dave All as well. And it was just like, hey, we're going to give you a data set in Excel. It's just going to be like a rough schedule, what hour, how many rides there were, et cetera. And you're going to have to create some insights with it and answer like 5 questions. And you're going to have an hour, and then you're going to have to call back, and, we're going to call you and we're going to like grill you on that. And sort of it evolved over time. And I think that the hard part of that was it was objective in the sense that like we knew what the rubric of things that we were looking for, but it was also hard to know like, hey, what does a 90 look like on this versus 100 versus a 60? And it was hard to really get that granular. So over time, we evolved it. I think me and Billy were grading tests at one point with Dave All, and like we'd have email threads, and then we'd have GMs that'd be like, oh, I think this candidate passed, and it was just too soft. And we're just like, okay, like we can't keep doing this. So on Pro, we worked to create a new version of the analytics test. Emily Jorgens and I kind of did it with a couple of other people. And it was a multiple choice analytics test. And of course, like it worked. We were able to see like what happened and if a candidate could pass or not. But then as soon as we put it up, within a month, it was leaked online. And there was some guy in Turkey that was selling like pass the Uber analytics test, like $100. And everybody was buying this thing. And we sent this guy cease and desist, et cetera. But over the life of like the Uber analytics test, and I believe it's still running today in like some way, version or form, like 100,000 people have taken this test. It's truly wild. If engineers have like a technical interview, we certainly had like an analytical one.
How did you get around the fact that the test was out there?
We just kept coming up with new questions, right? It was kind of like whack-a-mole in a way.
Yeah, it's got to constantly evolve. Do you see that out there? Is anybody else doing something like that? I mean, Uber maybe still does it. Anybody else do something like that? Do you ever see anything?
I mean, you see it, right? Especially for like business operations type roles. It's definitely a thing. I think the challenge is with AI. Now, like, somebody can have a co-pilot up on their screen and they can just kind of get all the answers. So, I saw a tweet the other night that was like request for startup in-person testing or interview centers where it's just a total clean room. I don't think it's a bad idea, but it might be like the area where we need to head.
Yeah, crazy. I mean, people are always trying to get one step ahead, whether they're buying the test from Turkey or using a co-pilot. How do you sort of define Travis as an entrepreneur and somebody who obviously was just so hard driving and, just everything that sort of came out about from the narrative around Uber? How do you think about all that?
I mean, I think Travis is the GOAT. Right. He is an incredible entrepreneur. His superpower is he can go super far in the weeds and zoom down to like the most atomic level or the tiniest bit. And then he could zoom out and see the entire chessboard. And I think like that is incredible for him. And just having spent time with him and jammed on stuff before, it's just an incredible gift that is incredibly rare.
If you look back at your time at Uber, at this crazy unicorn startup, you joined, first 100 people. What are your kind of couple of core learnings that you would say stand out the most?
I think my biggest learnings from working at Uber were a couple. One is that being in person builds trust. I think like for us, being face to face with drivers every day built trust, and we helped them build their business. And I couldn't imagine doing that in like a remote first world. I think the second thing is like the way that you build respect is through speed. You do what you say you're going to do and do it in like a really meaningful way. And I think like being consistent and doing something over and over again is a lot better than, saying fancy words or saying it nicely or having charisma. The last thing is that, you have to own your story or other people will.
Explain that one a bit more. I mean, how do you then try and explain your story? And how do you think Uber did well on that and missed the mark on that?
So I think we could have done a much better job of owning our story. I think the media loves to classically build companies up on the way up. And there was a while where like TechCrunch was kind of Uber Crunch and they would cover everything and we'd get a lot of favorable press.
And win awards.
We'd win awards. We won the Crunchies. It was like a huge deal. And then, something flipped where, look, we were growing really fast. We were probably a bit cocky and got over our skis. And, we thought that we had it all in the bag. And I think just like they like to build you up on the way up, they love to tear you down on the way down. And they love to throw every kick, every punch. They love to scrap at you. And I think like our narrative just got out of control, right? Like I think there are 3 sides to every story: what he said, what they said, and sort of what actually happened. And I think that in the course of Uber, there's been a lot out there that just isn't like factually correct, mainly from the media. And that's why I'm so excited about what you're doing here, to kind of tell the story and rewrite the script.
No, dude, 100%. And appreciate you being a part of it. Is there anything that you think, though, specifically that Uber could have done differently?
I think our comms with drivers early was just very transactional, right? Like go here, go there. And like we should have just built more love and trust. And I think that probably would have helped, our relationships with drivers would have probably helped the labor laws, et cetera. I think that we wish that we were living in like a less competitive world where we didn't have to compete with competitors sort of on every single continent with a SoftBank funded like competitor popping up everywhere and burning lots of money. I think China was a really interesting case study and we ultimately got to an incredible outcome there. But like that was just a game that was just so complicated. And I don't think that a lot of companies could have done what Uber did. And I think ultimately like we were successful there because we had a great team.
Totally agree on the driver comms. It was tough because I think there was also a big push from a legality standpoint of keep it transactional. These are not employees. Don't treat them like they are employees. And we were so concerned about the labor laws. And again, with good reason. And then you add in all the competition and it kind of created this perfect storm where I think the company definitely just missed on the management of drivers. And again, I get why, but it's just unfortunate because, I think with a little bit more TLC there, we would have probably been in better shape.
I mean, what's just crazy about the whole employee classification thing is we were talking about this in 2009 and 2010. It's now 2025 and the US still doesn't have a good framework for how you differentiate employee versus contractor. So I think there was an opportunity to kind of set the narrative and change things, but the government has just completely lost control.
Yeah, like a number of other things like the NCAA and a million other things. All right, why did you decide to leave Uber?
Yeah, so I spent 6 years at Uber from 2012 to 2018. Spent most of my 20s there. It was an incredible ride, helped out the transition from Travis to Dara. And then after that time, I was just like, okay, cool. I spent, a lot of time here. It's time for something else. I had met my girlfriend out in San Francisco, who's now my wife, and we decided to move back to the East Coast. I was from Florida. She was from North Carolina. And we settled in New York. It's been, incredible. I've been mostly focused on investing since then, but love and miss operating. It's just the most fun that you can have. So doing a lot of advising now and working with founders that are super interesting.
What stands out? I mean, again, I know you've done a lot of this work with founders. Anything specifically as you sort of think about the Uber experience in ways that you've been able to help founders? Anything sort of specific that always maybe comes up time and time again?
I mean, I think people want to know how Uber solved the chicken and egg problem, which we talked about earlier. They want to know how to hire great teams. They want to know what specifically, were the tactics that we used to grow and sort of acquire drivers. And I think like my number one learning coming out of Uber was that talent density is incredibly rare. Having that group of people at Uber when we did was just a 0.0001% chance of getting everybody united. And the reality is there are very few startups that can have that talent density. And once you get outside Uber and you look around, you're like, whoa, that was a really special place in time.
At that time is the important piece, right? Where there was just less startups, less venture capital. You could have this talent density that now that group of people would have been so quickly dispersed across a bunch of other companies. Also, companies that have real magnitude are just valued much higher more quickly. And so then the accumulation of stock and of, equity upside and whatever else is just harder to happen than when I joined Uber, it was Series A or something. It was a lot of different time than now, some of these AI companies will have multi-billion valuations before they even get going.
So you joined at a $50 million post.
Yeah.
Today, Uber is worth $150 billion. I'm not going to do math in public, but that's pretty good.
Yes, it's pretty good. In the beginning of the show, we will see, but I could do a hand motion for what it will look like. But I do the employee number that you were, and then what we're at now, which is like 30,000 plus. And then the same thing on the valuation.
Wild.
I mean, it's pretty crazy. I mean, RM was like 10 million valuation or something absurd like that.
It's probably the first round.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
First round led the seed.
Yeah. All right. If we could go back, first couple of days of Atlanta, 23-year-old Scott sitting there, doesn't know what he's doing, barely. What advice would you give to that guy?
Just keep going. It's going to be really hard. Take a lot of pictures. I was going back and, I am a little sad that I don't have more pictures of that time. I have a lot of driver documents and papers and pictures of town cars, but I wish that we had taken more pictures to celebrate the journey. And then, the other thing that I've gotten into since Uber is journaling. Like, I wish that I had written down like just a daily dump of thoughts of things that were happening and stuff, because it just would have been such an incredible thing to look back on. So if you're a founder or an early employee at a company now, that's going to be something you look back on and think is really cool.
Yeah, be that guy, take the picture, be annoying. How often are you journaling?
Like every day.
Really?
Yeah.
You like a page, or what's your
like
kind of protocol?
Just whatever's going on in the day.
Any prompts, or just kind of let it rip?
No, just let it rip.
All right, nice. Yeah, I was doing the artist way or whatever for a bit, which is like 3 pages of just kind of mental dump. But no, that's great, man. I love it. Dude, you're the man. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. This is super fun.
All right, man.
Love it.
See ya.